We'd like to welcome you to the Charles and Annaley Red Lecture this evening. We're grateful for your attendance here and know that you're going to be well rewarded for your attendance. We'll begin with a word of prayer from Dennis Cutchins from the English department. Then I'll tell you a little bit about Charlie and Annaley, and then Brendan will introduce our speakers.
Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful that we can gather this evening together for a few minutes. We're grateful for the chance we have to learn, grateful for this university, grateful for the Red Center and for the efforts they make to bring good scholars into the university and to teach the faculty and the students here. We pray that Thou would bless Dr. Nelson, that she'll be able to present the material that she has, and we're grateful for her attendance. And we ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Charles, or Charlie Redd, was born in San Juan, Utah to Lemuel H. Redd Jr. in a log cabin with a dirt roof and dirt floor. His education in the School of Hard Knocks was complemented by formal training in a one-room school. In that environment, he soon showed himself to be a natural-born leader. On completion of his training in the lower grades, Charlie's parents decided to send him over 300 miles away to Provo, Utah, to BY Academy, where he enrolled in high school. He was known as a leader and a pusher, participating in every activity from school plays to baseball. In the meantime, he was also learning the routines of ranching in San Juan. After serving a Northwestern States mission for the LDS Church, in 1914 he became manager of the LaSalle Livestock Company, later known as the Red Ranches, whose bull sale is on April 11th if you'd like to buy a registered bull, both red and black. Mr. Redd has won wide recognition for his application of scientific knowledge to livestock breeding and range improvement. He insisted his livestock be more productive and efficient and well adapted to the dry and rough ranges of southeastern Utah and western Colorado. Throughout Colorado,
yeah, come on.
Right. My wife would feel the same. Through extensive brush eradication and grass planting, Mr. Redd increased the capacity 10 times of his rangeland. And in 1946, he was selected as Man of the Year in Livestock. He later became the director of the Cowboy Hall of Fame and won a number of awards. Annaley Naegle Redd was a prominent southeastern Utah rancher and philanthropist, and Charlie Redd's wife. They married in 1931. Annaley was born in the Mormon colonies in Mexico in 1910. Her family was forced to flee during the Mexican Revolution. Once back in the United States, her father provided no support materially or emotionally to Annaley and her mother, even when the families lived in the same town. Despite economic hardships, Annaley graduated from high school and completed her normal school education degree at BYU. She taught school in LaSalle, Utah, where she met and married Charlie Redd. She worked as a partner on his cattle company, including duties as cook, storekeeper, and secretary. When bankers came to foreclose on the ranch during the 1930s, Annaley's famous cooking, especially her prairie fire beans, helped save the ranch. Charlie suffered a stroke in 1972, the same year the two of them organized and donated a substantial amount to create the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies here at BYU. His wife cared for him until his death in 1976. She and Charlie are the parents of 9 children. Later, Annaley purchased her family home, a historic winery in Tokerville, and restored it. She belonged to literary clubs and enjoyed reading before she passed away in August of 2000. And Charlie left this message that he wanted to be read to young people who are learning about history. Quote, "I would like somehow to get into the hearts and souls of young people the lessons of history, particularly those of Western America. The American pioneer has much to teach us, with his insistence on individual freedom of action, spirit of adventurousness, and willingness to accept challenges. He reminds us how precious is the heritage of individual freedom. Perhaps more important to youth today is how acceptance of challenge and risk-taking strengthens character and contributes to individual growth. Only through the acceptance and great challenges and struggle with adversity is the human soul enlarged and extended. Learning of the successful settlement of this country, we may gain courage to face squarely the challenges and problems of present-day frontiers. Charlie Redd. Would the members of the Redd family please raise their hand or stand? Thank you. I'll turn the time over to our Associate Director, Brendan Renzink, who will give an introduction for our speaker today.
Dr. Megan Kate Nelson is a writer and historian of the American Civil War, the American West, popular culture, and the environment. She earned a bachelor's in history and literature from Harvard and a PhD in American studies from the University of Iowa. She was a professor at Texas Tech and Cal State Fullerton, also taught at Harvard, MIT, and Brown. And while she grew up in the West and spent many of her adult years in the West, she has regrettably been suffering in Boston for the past decade. Her residence is only about 5 minutes from Walden Pond, however, so if it was good enough for Emerson and Thoreau, maybe it's not half bad. I'll have to go see myself. Nelson has written extensively in both academic and public venues. Her 2 previous monographs, both published by the University of Georgia Press, were Trembling Earth, A Cultural History of the Okefenokee Swamp, published in 2005, and Ruin Nation, Destruction in the American Civil War in 2012. Her talk today, When the Civil War Came West, draws from her new book, The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. It was published a mere 2 weeks ago by Scribner Books. It's part of a growing field of scholarship that is pulling our Civil War gaze away from eastern battlefields and out to the West and reminding us of the primacy of the West in a lot of the lead up to the Civil War. Much of the Civil War was fought over competing visions of what America's westward expanding empire would look like and what it would be. I most appreciated how in her book, and if you listened to my last podcast episode, you heard us both drone on about this for a good hour. But I particularly appreciated how her book takes Civil War conflicts and ties them together with the subjugation of Native peoples and conflicts with the Native peoples in the West that both precede and then continue on after the contest between the Union and the Confederacy is over. So please join me with welcoming Dr. Nelson for today's session.
Oh. Oh. That's very exciting. I didn't know there was going to be swag, so this is extremely exciting. Well, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I am delighted to be delivering the 2020 Annaley Naegle Redd Lecture. Thank you to Jay and to Brendan for inviting me to come. And I know that Amy is not here right now because she's busy doing the work that she does, so she's going to miss this. But I've already thanked her already for all of the coordination of my travel, which was a sort of exciting time coming from Boston at this time of year. So, and before I begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we meet here tonight on the traditional lands of the Ute and the Goshute peoples. So as Brendan mentioned, I have a book out, hot off the presses, available in local bookstores and online, called The Three-Cornered War. And The Three-Cornered War tells the story of the Civil War in the far West. Most of the action takes place in New Mexico and Arizona, as well as Texas, Colorado, and California. So this is not a region that Americans usually think of, right? When we think of the Civil War. I grew up in Colorado, not this Colorado business. I don't know what that's about. I grew up in Colorado, and I learned nothing about the Civil War in this region. right? I grew up, I learned about pioneers, I learned about silver mining. We learned a little bit about the Indian Wars, but they were always later in the late 19th century. We learned a little bit even about the ski industry, but we didn't learn anything about the Civil War, and I certainly didn't learn about the fact that Colorado soldiers had a very large role to play in the conflict. So Civil War historians also overlook the war in the West to the extent that the tradition in the field is that we refer to all the events in the Trans-Mississippi as the West, which makes it really hard to talk about anything happening west of the West, right? So I've been referring to it as, and I know you all will appreciate this, the real West, right? Also, if you look at a lot of Civil War histories and they include maps that say the seat of war, often those maps will just end at the 100th meridian, which is like kind of halfway through Texas and moves up through Kansas and Nebraska and up into the Northwest, or the middle Northwest, which is usually what environmental historians point to as the eastern border of the West, right? This is where there's, to the east, there's enough rainfall that you don't need irrigation. To the west, it's rising elevation, more aridity, you need irrigation for crops. So environmental historians usually say the West begins at the 100th meridian and extends to the Pacific. That's only one way to think about the West. But what then happens is that in all of our Civil War history, the West is quite literally erased from our notions of that conflict. And this is just befuddling, right? Because whenever we talk about the coming of the war, like all of these conflicts in the 1840s and 1850s that brought the North and the South to this moment where they had to, the South seceded and the war began, we're always talking about the West, right? We're talking about the Mexican-American War, we're talking about the territories that we gained from that, and then again from the Gadsden Purchase. Was there going to be slavery in the territories? They fought about that. Was there going to be, transcontinental railroad? If so, what route was it going to take? They sent out 4 survey teams, 2 in the north and 2 in the south. They couldn't decide. They were fighting all the time about the West, right? And then Fort Sumter happens, and it's like everyone just forgot that all of this had actually been about the West. And so that sort of suggests, I think, to historians and to anyone interested in Civil War history that the West, that nothing happened in the West, and that it didn't actually include any meaningful action. Well, in the Three-Cornered War, I argue the opposite of that, which is that a lot happened, and it was extremely meaningful. So why was all this going on? So in the spring of 1861, the West was really up for grabs. We have a map here from early in the war where you can see a really interesting element, which is that Arizona did not yet exist. New Mexico territory extended from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River and was the only territory standing in the way between Texas and California. So the Union and the Confederacy wanted control of the West, California in particular, for 2 things: its gold and its Pacific ports, right? Because wars are extremely expensive. You have to pay for them somehow. And so both the Union and the Confederacy wanted those gold mines to start producing wealth. They could bring that back east. It could shore up bond sales, all sorts of interesting financial stuff. The Confederacy also was really interested in the Pacific ports, because already at the beginning of the war, the blockade was starting to work, right, of the Atlantic coast and the Gulf South. They needed an outlet for their cotton, again, to pay for the war. And the deep water ports of San Diego and Los Angeles would be perfect for them, right? Also, and the Union wanted to keep the gold mines and the Pacific ports out of the hands of the Confederacy, for those same reasons, but except they wanted to prevent the Confederacy from sending all that cotton out. So both the Union and the Confederacy also saw the West as central to their kind of visions of what the future would be. And I think some Civil War historians have talked about this, about what people on the ground were sort of thinking about what was possibly going to happen to the nation in the wake of the war. Well, for the Union, the West became the center of this vision they had of an empire of free labor. That the West was going to be free of enslavement, the entire nation was going to be free of enslavement, and it was in the West that white farmers, and maybe some black farmers as well, would settle and cultivate, and again, create wealth, but also just create a kind of stable community. Now for the Confederacy, they saw the West as the center of their growing empire of slavery. If they could expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, then the West would become kind of a crossroads where they could start moving south into Mexico and Latin America. That was the vision. Okay, so it was for all of these reasons, both kind of financial and also ideological. So why did the Confederacy in particular think that they could possibly take a region as gigantic as the West with the army that they had while they were busy fighting in the Eastern Theater? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, mining towns across the West were filled pretty evenly with Northerners and Southerners. All that migration going west for the gold rushes was moving in sort of direct lines in the South and the North. So when the war broke out, there were actual fights and gunplay, like at flagpoles in mining camps and in cities. Denver City was one, Taos was one, Kit Carson broke up that one, and sort of raised back up the Union flag. So there was a real possibility that if the Confederacy took these mining towns, that there would be a sort of a group of secessionists who would help them take it. They would have on-the-ground help. Also, the political loyalty of three other populations was really uncertain at the beginning of the war. First of all, Hispanos in New Mexico territory, so this enormous space right here, both New Mexico and Arizona as we know it now, had pretty recently become American citizens, right? The Mexican-American War and the land cessions there meant they had not migrated to the United States. The border had moved over them, right? And they just kind of stayed in place. And they were given the choice, and many of them chose to stay and become American citizens. But there was still a little bit of instability there about how they were going to kind of run their territory, who was in charge, and what kind of goals they would have. Also, Hispanos in this region had a system of enslavement. They had a very long history of raiding warfare with native communities in the area, especially Apaches and Comanches and Navajos. And in that kind of cycle of raiding warfare, all of those groups took captives that became enslaved laborers in those communities. So indigenous peoples had Hispano captives and slaves, and Hispano farms and households had indigenous slaves. So the Confederates thought, they are pro-slavery, right? It's not black slavery, and it's not on the scale as it is in the South, but Confederates thought, you might be on our side for that reason. Mormons in Utah, also unclear. Who were they going to go with, right? Just a few years before, they had had their own rebellion against the US government. So the Confederates were like, Brigham Young might come to play. He might lend us his, thousands of very well-trained and well-armed soldiers to hold the West, and particularly to take the overland trail, right? And monitor it, and cut off US troops from their supply lines further east. And then also native peoples across the West. They had been resisting outside powers for as long as they had been living in this region, whether those outside powers were indigenous or whether they were Spanish, Mexican, or then American. And they were no fans of the US Army. So the Confederates thought they might be willing to make some alliances. Why wouldn't they? Right? The US government hasn't done much for them in recent memory. Now, of course, in New Mexico and Arizona, Apaches and Navajos, in particular, saw the Civil War, this kind of growing clash between the Union and the Confederacy, as an invasion of their territories, right? They had lived there first. These were their regions, and in the Three-Cornered War, there's a map at the beginning that shows you the continental map from Atlantic to Pacific, with Union states and territories, Confederate states, and also Apache and Diné-Bikéyah, the Navajo homeland and the Apache homeland. So you can see all of those territories in play. But of course, these indigenous groups were obstacles to both the Union and the Confederate visions of the West. So then, what happened? The Confederacy was convinced enough by their odds in this region that in the summer of 1861, they made their move. So this is pretty early in the war, right? Right around the time of the first battle, Bull Run, a small group of mounted Confederates led by John Robert Baylor, who I'll introduce you to more specifically a little later, invaded New Mexico territory from Texas. They occupied Mesilla, which is located where this kind of southernmost star is, forced the surrender of 400 Union troops at Fort Fillmore. And on August 1st, 1861, John Baylor sat down in Mesilla, put pen to paper, and created the Confederate territory of Arizona. So if you take one little cocktail party tidbit from this talk, this is it. Arizona came into being during the Civil War, and it came into being as a Confederate territory. Its borders were not the same as we know now. It was actually the southern half of that big chunk of New Mexico territory. And the reason for that, of course, is that Baylor wanted a thoroughfare from Texas all the way to California. So he's like, the Confederacy now exists from the Atlantic to the Colorado River in July of 1861. Now, Baylor and his troops were followed by a much larger force of 3,000 Texans, marching under a former U.S. Army officer named Henry Hopkins Sibley. They came on this route that you can see. Yellow is the way out, and spoiler alert, blue is the way back. It did not ultimately go well for them, but they did this incredibly long march, which all told is about 2,000 miles. On the way there, they were mostly on horseback. On the way back, they were mostly not. So they came from San Antonio to El Paso, about 600 miles, stayed at Fort Bliss for a little bit, and then moved northward into New Mexico territory. And this was around kind of Christmas of 1861. Now, meanwhile, the Union was marshaling its defenses. So the colonel in charge here, E.R.S. Canby, brought Union troops together along the Rio Grande. Here I've created this map kind of showing you where they're all coming from. So all the arrows are sort of, they're not, you can't see the arrows because I couldn't do it with this particular tool, but they're all coming and congregating and coalescing along the Rio Grande where all of the Union's big forts were. So this was a very interesting army. It was made up of Army regulars, so the professional soldiers, who were coming in from forts all over the region. So this is where they're coming in from Arizona, they're coming in from Fort Defiance up in Navajo country, and they're coming in from Fort Stanton there, kind of furthest to the west, or furthest to the east. Colorado gold miners, who had come to Colorado in the 1859 gold rush, and were still up in the mines trying to make their fortune in the fall of 1861, figured, you know what, we don't have much to do this winter, so the war has come to us, so why don't we sign up? We'll get fed, we'll get outfits, we'll get to fight some Texans, it'll be fantastic. So they came down from Denver and from the Rocky Mountain gold mines, trained in Canyon City, and came down through Fort Garland and Taos to Santa Fe, and then down the Rio Grande. Hispano volunteers, officers, and militia signed up from towns and ranches in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and along the Rio Grande. So this was a miscalculation on the Confederates' part. And this was a major one. There are 50,000 Hispanos living in this region at this point. Now, the reason they threw in with the Union, or most of them did, some of them did not, some of them helped out the Confederacy, but most of them threw in with the Union because they had a very long memory back to 1841. Which was the last time Texas tried to invade New Mexico. And they had no love of Texans. In fact, their hatred of Texans was more intense than perhaps their enmity for the US government. Also, they are acting in defense of their own communities. Here's an invading force that is coming. It was pretty well known once the Texans got there that their strategy was going to be to live off the land. And that meant taking food from Hispano farmers, right? They said they were going to pay, but most often they did not pay. So they were defending their own communities from attack. And then the fourth group that came into the Union Army at this point came from pueblos and indigenous communities in New Mexico. So there were Ute and Pueblo scouts and spies that were working at various times for this fighting force. They were recruited by Kit Carson, who had a past as an Indian agent. So he brought them in himself. So here's another reason why this war in this theater is so interesting. This is the most diverse fighting force in the entire war in any theater. Right? And this is long before the Emancipation Proclamation brings black soldiers into the Union in a meaningful way, into the Union Army. So the war begins in February 1862. The Confederate Army kind of rests a little bit from their march across West Texas in the middle of winter, which is actually, if you've ever been there, you know, it can get actually pretty harsh down there. So they recovered from this long march, and then they started marching north. And they first met a little bit north of these ruins. These are the ruins of Fort Craig, which still stand. They've been saved by the state of New Mexico. You can go and visit them. Fort Craig was in the center of New Mexico. It was the second largest military installation in the territory. And Canby had concentrated his entire army there to meet this Confederate invasion. So Sibley marched his Texans right up there. He took a look at the fort. His big plan was to actually take the fort because it had so many provisions and arms and clothing and other things that his army needed. But he decided it was too well defended. So he crossed the Rio Grande. He went north, went around a mesa, and he was going to cross this ford at a place called Valverde. And then he would be between the Union Army at Fort Craig and Albuquerque. The Union Army met him there. They had a one-day battle. I'm going to talk about these battles just in a more general sense to just give you a flavor and who won and then why it was important. But if you have questions about these, we can talk about them in the Q&A. So ultimately, the Confederates won. They had, as I always used to tell my students, you can talk about all the charges on any day of a battle, but the most important one is the last one, because that determines who wins. So the Confederates saw a hole open in the Union center right around their battery of guns. They charged it, got the guns, and forced the Federals to retreat back across the Rio Grande and go back to Fort Craig. So they won this major battle against this larger Union army, which is also an unusual thing. Usually the sort of usual kind of way of thinking about these kinds of battles is that you really have to outnumber, if you're going to be on the attack, you have to outnumber the defending force by a significant margin, like anywhere from 2 to 1 to 4 to 1. But the Confederates, who are actually outnumbered about 3 to 4, won this battle. So they stayed there for 2 days, and then they started marching north. They took Albuquerque, occupied it. They took Santa Fe and occupied it. So here's another thing. This army, which became called the Sibley Brigade, is the only Confederate army to take and occupy a northern capital during the Civil War. And they bragged on that for the rest of the war. Believe me. But Sibley had a problem. Union troops, as they were abandoning Albuquerque and Santa Fe, had either taken all the supplies with them or burned them. So there are these terrible sort of accounts where these Confederate soldiers enter Albuquerque and they can smell the bacon burning. And they're just like, oh, want that bacon. But they were in a little bit of dire straits. They had found some caches of supplies, but they didn't have enough. And it really takes a lot to not only move a couple thousand soldiers through a high desert, but also to feed them and keep them warm in February, right, and March. So they kept moving. So they moved up the Santa Fe Trail. Their target was Fort Union, which was another big fort in the region, kind of in the northern reaches of the territory. And they needed to get the supplies there. They were going to attack the fort. Unbeknownst to them, 1,000 Colorado soldiers had just marched in. Again, recruited from the mines and from Denver City to defend Fort Union. So they met in 2 battles, Apache Canyon and Glorieta Pass, in late March. And Apache Canyon was sort of this kind of back and forth. The Union managed to force the Confederates back along the road. But Glorieta Pass was actually a battlefield win for the Confederates. However, the Union commander during this battle was this lawyer from Denver who had no military experience. But like most lawyers, he read a lot of books. So he had read all of these military strategy books, and he was like, I'm going to do a flanking maneuver. So he sent a third of his guys under John Shivington, the fighting Methodist, who will unfortunately become famous for the Sand Creek Massacre several years later, sends him around on Glorieta Mesa. They come in behind the Texans, where their 80-wagon train is just sitting there, guarded by like 5 guys. So they captured the wagon train, they burned it, they took all the animals, they took the animals they wanted, let the others go. So the Confederates were victorious at Glorieta, but they had no wagon train. And this is one of those moments which actually, you're sort of like, okay, this is an important moment. If you're sort of on the side of the Union, you're like, yes, this is great. They get pushed back here. But when you're a historian, among all of the items destroyed in those wagon trains were the diaries and letters of the Sibley Brigade. So bad. So we have no idea how many sources we lost, but the Union Army destroyed them all in this effort. And they did, in fact, succeed. Without supplies, Sibley could not hope to continue this campaign for the West. It is just too difficult. And this is, Brendan mentioned I'm an environmental historian. This is one of the kind of strong arguments in the book, is that the high desert is exerting a lot of pressures on these armies. Because the numbers may seem pretty small to you, right? Like there are tens of thousands of soldiers engaged in the East. There are only 3,000 on one side and 4,000 on the other in this theater. But these are the largest fighting forces ever seen in the Southwest in one place. And the high desert cannot sustain those kinds of numbers during this period. There's not enough water, there's not enough food, and the weather conditions are really quite terrible. So the Confederates, if you think back to that like route backwards, they retreated from Santa Fe all the way down. They took a little detour into the Magdalena Mountains to avoid any kind of battle with Union troops, and got back to the border, to Fort Bliss and to Mesilla in late May of 1862. And then they retreated to San Antonio, mostly on foot, in the summer. So it is not surprising that through this entire ordeal, the Sibley Brigade actually lost somewhere between 20 and 30% of their men. Most of them not to battle wounds, but to exposure, to dehydration, and to starvation. So the Confederacy's campaign for the West was over. Meanwhile, so this is where you get the meanwhile. Throughout this campaign, Chiricahuas Apaches in the south and Navajos in the north were raiding both Union and Confederate wagon trains, army camps, and towns and ranches. And in fact, Henry Sibley blamed his defeat in part on these raids, was saying he was constantly under assault from these indigenous groups. So while all of this was unfolding, James Henry Carlton, another career Army officer, was marching 2,000 California soldiers, which became known as the California Column, from Los Angeles to Tucson, and then Tucson to the Rio Grande. So another crazy long march through a desert landscape. Along the way, in July of 1862, his men fought a battle with the Chiricahuas at Apache Pass, which is the the kind of bigger star here on the right. They actually took control of Apache Pass, which was vital. There's a spring there that's the only water supply within a 60-mile radius. And it's on a very important mail route, the sort of southern mail route, the Butterfield route. And so they were taking control of that all the way to the Rio Grande. The California column arrived too late to fight the Confederates, but James Carlton took over the Department of New Mexico from ERS Canby in September of 1862. He had 3,000 or 4,000 men with 2 years left in their enlistments. So, pretty much right away, Carlton turned to another enemy. He implemented a new Union Indian policy in the West, and its basic kind of rule was no more treaties. And Carlton's plan was make war on indigenous communities first, force them to surrender, remove them to reservations, and then civilize them there through farming, English education, and Christianization. So Carlton initiated 3 campaigns against Native Americans in New Mexico. In the fall of 1862, Kit Carson led a very short campaign against the Mescalero Apaches. And he sent 400 Mescalero men, women, and children to a reservation he had created called Bosque Redondo. Also in the fall of 1862, he sent another one of his favorite commanders, Joseph Rodman West, to make war on the Chiricahuas Apaches. The Union Army ended up luring, well, it was actually a mix of sort of miners and Union Army, 1st California soldiers, lured the Chiricahuas Apache famous war leader Mangus Coloradus into a parley, arrested him, and then while they had him imprisoned, claimed that he was trying to escape, but really they murdered him in his cell. Then a couple days later, one of the surgeons went out, dug up his body, cut off his head, boiled the head down to the skull, and kept it in his tent for several years before sending it to a phrenologist, those doctors who study skull shape. This actually had the opposite effect that Carlton had intended. Usually when you take out a leader in a military situation, that sort of brings a swift end to some of the fighting. This actually accelerated the Apache Wars. Geronimo and Cochise were so enraged by what had happened to Mangus Coloradus that they launched an all-out war against the US Army that lasted for more than 20 years. And then in the fall of 1863 through 1868, Carlton, well, Kit Carson was involved in sort of the first phase of this, but he sent Kit Carson out into western New Mexico, eastern Arizona, to Diné-Bikéyah, the Navajo homeland, to make hard war on the Navajo people. And these were hard wars. They were attacking Native communities, they destroyed their crops, they destroyed their houses and their housewares, and doing all of this in the fall made it very difficult for the Navajos to survive in the winter. And so starting in the winter of 1864, hundreds and then thousands of Navajos surrendered to the Union Army. And they were sent to Bosque Redondo, a reservation for Mescalero Apaches and Navajos. Bosque Redondo was a disaster from the start. The site was poorly chosen. Carlton's officers went out there to take a look at it, and they actually told him it was awful, and that really they should put it 40 miles north, where there was better water and there were more trees for wood. And he refused because he didn't want the Navajos any closer to the Santa Fe Trail than they already would have been. And Bosque Redondo is sort of right in central New Mexico on a big bend in the Pecos River. There was bad water in the Pecos, very little wood to build shelters. So this is a photograph of what their very rudimentary shelters looked like. And if you know, in terms of building winter housing, Navajos preferred to build a hogan, which is built out of wood. It's built to very specific specifications based on their cosmologies. And instead, this is what they were forced to build for themselves, which is basically like huts made out of mud and sticks. There were environmental disasters. The Navajos were forced to plant 3,000 acres of corn that were destroyed in successive years by cutworms and hailstorms. And then they also had inadequate rations because Bosque Redondo was so far from the Santa Fe Trail that it was extraordinarily expensive to like ship any goods there, and it took forever. So they were often on half or 1/3 rations. So the Mescalero Apaches who were there left en masse in November 1865. There's actually, at the National Archives, they took census records. Carlton was this meticulous guy, and he took census records every day of the population. And on that day in November of 1865, it says Mescaleros, 365, gone. Like they just left. And the Union Army gave chase, but they could not actually chase them down. The Mescaleros eluded them. The Navajos who remained suffered an almost 25% mortality rate at Bosque Redondo. And conditions were so terrible there that Navajos began to call it Waildi, or the land of suffering. So Carlton was ultimately removed from command in 1867, and the Navajos negotiated a treaty to go back to their homeland in the summer of 1868. It was a bittersweet victory for them. They forced the US government to recognize their sovereignty and were able to return to their traditional lands. But they did have to agree to live on a reservation, to have an Indian agent, and to be policed. So why was the war in the West important to the war in the East? So for the Confederacy, they lost access to those ports and the chance to fund their war effort. And this created economic pressures for them in the East on soldiers and civilians. And basically at this point, they're surrounded on all sides by Union states and territories, and their dream of the empire of slavery really died. For the Union, they gained some advantages over the Confederacy. Their blockade started to work. They had more war funding. Also, after the defeat of the Confederates in the spring and summer of 1862, the Republican Congress was able to pass a series of legislative acts that you may have heard of but may not have associated with the Civil War. The Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, which enabled the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Morrill Land Grant Act, which allowed states and territories to sell public land to fund universities that studied agriculture and mechanical arts. And they created the Department of Agriculture. So all of these worked toward the Union's vision of the empire of free labor in the West. But they also necessitated the removal of native peoples. So the Union's campaigns against Navajos and Apaches changed the course of the history of the West and the history of indigenous communities there. So as you can gather from just this brief overview, the war in the West was complicated. It involved many different groups of people, and it took place across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. So my challenge in this book, The Three-Cornered War, was, how do I tell this story? How do I tell this story in a way that makes sense and that allows all of this complexity to come forward? And my unlikely inspiration was the Game of Thrones. So if you have ever read this book or seen the series, you know that it has a multi-perspective narrative. You move from one person to the next across space and time. Sometimes those characters will come together in one place. Sometimes they're dispersed everywhere else. So I decided to try this approach and bring the reader of The Three-Cornered War into the Civil War West through the experiences of 9 different people. And if you think that's a lot, I mean, Game of Thrones has like 100. So I think 9 is sort of reasonable. But they all represent different communities. They all give different kind of representations and kind of show you different aspects of the war on the ground. So I'm not gonna introduce all 9 to you, but very briefly, I'm gonna introduce a couple of people. So this is John Robert Baylor. And when I started to think about this project, I knew I wanted to begin the Three-Cornered War with him and the invasion of New Mexico territory in July of 1861. So Baylor was born in Kentucky. He moved to Texas in the 1840s, lured by the promise of rich cotton land and the right to own slaves. He got married, started a family. Over the next 15 years, he worked as a farmer and then a rancher. He enslaved black men and women in both ventures. He read the law, was elected to the Texas state legislature. He also became the editor of a newspaper called The White Man. And this is the thing you have to love about 19th century racists, right? They're like super obvious about all of it. So The White Man published these lurid tales of Comanche atrocities. Baylor used those as excuses to ride out with these sort of proto-Texas Rangers in pursuit of Comanches so he could kill them with impunity. By the spring of 1861 then, John Baylor was primed to join the Confederate Army in the defense of slavery, secession, and the right of white men to wrest lands away from native peoples. By all accounts, he was a charismatic man and a capable commander. I started to refer to him in my research as Crazy Eyes, mostly because of this photo, but also because he was impetuous, he was resentful, he was ambitious, and all of these characteristics shaped his actions in the Civil War West in 1861 and 1862. So Juanita was just a teenager when she married Manuelito, a powerful Navajo headman with a long history of resisting Spanish, Mexican, and American incursions on their homeland. Soon after their wedding, the Civil War began. The readers of the Three-Cornered War will follow Juanita as she, Manuelito, and their band negotiate with, manipulate, and evade Union forces in their homeland, and then are forced by impending starvation to surrender to the U.S. Army in the fall of 1866. So readers will kind of go along with Juanita and her family on the long walk from the Navajo homeland to Bosque Redondo, and then see kind of through her eyes what that experience is like for the next 2 years, which dominates the final part of the book. Juanita's wartime experience was one of suffering, but also of persistence and survival. Of all of the protagonists in the book, I think she is really the heart. And her story reveals the extent to which the Civil War and the rest was, in fact, a three-cornered war. So John Clark is probably the person in this book you will have never heard of before. He was a surveyor, a lawyer, a landowner in Illinois when the war began. He was too old in his early 40s, way too old, to shoulder a rifle, but he hoped to serve the Union Army in other ways. So President Lincoln appointed him the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1861. He had known Lincoln in Illinois because they were on the same lawyer circuit together. And Clark left his large family in order to take up his post, which he held until 1868. So actually, Clark and Juanita are the only two protagonists who are there from beginning to end in the book. Clark was the voice of the Lincoln administration in New Mexico Territory, a dedicated Republican who believed in the party's vision for the West as a landscape of free white labor, cleared of both secessionists and native peoples. Clark's 1863 surveys of the Arizona Gold Country helped to justify Union Army campaigns against Apaches and Navajos. And the letters he wrote to his superiors in Washington helped the Lincoln administration and the Republican Party envision the conquest of the West. Clark left New Mexico at the same time as the Navajos returned to their homeland. He did not go home to Illinois, though. He came here to Utah to serve as Surveyor General here for 1 year. And he was actually in Salt Lake City when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, with the Golden Spike. I was trying to figure out if he was actually at the ceremony, but I could never find. Clark wrote 27 volumes of diaries, which is how I found him in a library in Santa Fe. But he left no other diaries of his time after that. He basically left Utah and then went into private business, working for railroad corporations. And finally, James Henry Carlton, also a rather severe-looking gentleman. Carlton produced more primary document material than the other 8 protagonists in the Three-Cornered War combined. In command of the 1st California and then the Department of New Mexico, Carlton was a micromanager, writing copious letters and reports to his superiors and subordinates on a daily basis. He also just loved to write. So growing up in Maine, he had wanted to be a novelist. And in fact, when he was 24, he wrote a letter to Charles Dickens, enclosing a sample of his writing, and asking if he should move to London to kind of join that city's literary set. And in a rather kindly worded letter back, Dickens suggested to him that his talents might lie elsewhere. So Carlton did what other disappointed novelists did in the early 19th century, and he joined the military. So over his 20-year career as a dragoon before the Civil War, Carlton served on the frontier forts across the West, including Albuquerque and Santa Fe, where he actually met Kit Carson, leading cavalry companies on Indian campaigns. In 1861, he was at Fort Tejon outside Los Angeles with his wife, Sophia, and their 3 children. That fall, he was tapped to command the 1st California and lead them on this march from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande. From that point to his removal of command in from the Department of New Mexico 6 years later, he never took a furlough. Not one time. It is unclear if he ever saw his family again. So readers will follow Carlton and his California soldiers on this arduous march through the desert and into their fights with Mangus Coloradus's Chiricahua Apaches along the way. They will come to know him as the architect of the Union Army's campaigns against the Chiricahuas, the Mescaleros, and the Navajos, and discover why Carlton's decision-making regarding Bosque Redondo resulted in tragedy and heartbreak for the Navajo women, men, and children imprisoned there. So looking at the Civil War from this unexpected place, the far West, shows us a couple of important things. First, that the Civil War was a 3-cornered war in several ways. The conflict took place in the North, the South, and the West, between the Union, the Confederacy, and Native peoples, that involved Anglo, Hispano, and Native soldiers. It helps us to see how logistics and environment shaped warfare. I mean, we focus so much on battlefields, but actually soldiers only spent like 5% of their time fighting. The rest of the time, they spent marching and setting up camps and sleeping and writing letters home, right? So we need to pay attention to all of those things. The extreme nature of the high desert shaped the way all of these groups fought in the region. Both Carlton and Henry Sibley staggered their troops on the war to manage their water supplies. They relied on cash supplies and long wagon trains, and they ran up against a deep and wide Native knowledge base. The 3-cornered war also complicates our notions of the Union's just war, right? It helps us to understand that the Union fought simultaneously for emancipation of African Americans in the East and extermination or removal of Native Americans in the West. And they did not see these goals as contradictory. This is, I think, the hardest thing for us to grasp because we want them to be, sort of aligned in all of these respects. But they actually saw, the Union and the Republican government saw that both of these things worked toward their vision of an empire of free labor. So ultimately, seeing the war from the far West helps us to see the Civil War for what it actually was, which was a continental conflict, a truly national war that involved all regions and all people living within its borders. Thank you. So I think we may have a little bit of time for some questions. Yes?
Did that place become famous in 1945?
I don't know. Why would it have? It's right on the other side of the mountains from White Sands. Right. Yes. So this photograph is actually looking from the base of the Oregon Mountains, sort of east, toward Las Cruces, and then the mountains on the other side of the Rio Grande. Yeah, so White Sands was on the other side of the Oregon Mountains. Yeah, but Jornada del Muerto was a very famous stretch of desert in New Mexico. It was a 40-mile stretch with no water, like zero water.
That's how it's got its name.
Yes, exactly. Path of the Dead Man, or Dead Man's Journey, depending on how you want to do it. Yes, sir.
Your final few sentences really are kind of intriguing to me because what you seem to suggest is that this picture of the Civil War doesn't quite make sense until you think of the West too. Is, okay, so if that's the case, then what should come into focus, right? Not just that it was a three-cornered war, right? But what about the Civil War comes into focus when we think about it in terms of the West?
Sure. So I forgot that I promised to repeat the question. So what is it that ultimately comes into focus about the Civil War ultimately when we look at the West? Well, I mean, ultimately the larger picture is that this was not just a fight between the North and the South. It was a fight between the North and the South over the West and in the West and with the West. So that all the kind of images that we have of Gettysburg and Antietam and all of these major battles in the East kind of convince us that it's a war that is only fought in those regions about emancipation. But when we bring the full kind of continental conflict into it, we see it as a much fuller picture. That actually the Union and the Confederacy had a range of goals and that they were continental in scope. Does that make sense? You're still?
No, I'm digging it.
Okay, you're digging it. Good. Excellent. Yes, Spencer.
So thinking from a historian's perspective, the focus has been on the Eastern Theater for so long. Why do you think that is? I mean, it was that way before Ken Burns. Is it because the focus is on battles, and if you're just looking at size and proximity of battles, it's an Eastern war? Do you think that's the main problem, or is there something bigger in the historians in the historical community that makes the focus stay so Eastern?
Sure. So the question is why has there been a focus on the East for so long? Yeah, I mean, I think Civil War history was dominated by military historians until probably about 20 or 30 years ago, when social and cultural historians kind of got into it. And when you're just focused on one type of place, which is the battlefield, then you're going to go where the most of the battlefields are, right? Where the most soldiers are. And that is in the East. I have never argued, and I don't think anybody who works on this region has ever argued, that the West was more significant than the East, or that the battles here were sort of, more significant in the overall kind of 4-year pattern of the war than the battles in the East. But they're kind of reorienting our vision, and that allows us to see other things that are happening. So I think that's part of the reason also when social and cultural historians got into the game, they were also focused on the East, right? Because then you're talking about politics. You're talking about DC and Richmond, right? You're talking about emancipation. Then you're talking about 4 million people in the East, who are predominantly in the East and parts of the Trans-Mississippi West. And so then that's where the focus remains. And there have been people, there have actually been military historians doing work in this region, but just a handful, and they've never really gained traction. Native American historians and Western historians have focused on it, but in a different kind of register and in a different context. And there's almost no overlap between any of these fields in terms of historians who do all of these things. And so there hasn't been any kind of cross-conversation. So I think it's a matter of the way, the sort of things that historians like to talk about, which is like historiography, right? Like how people study what they study and why do we study what we study. But the great irony here is that this theater has the most kind of existing remaining Civil War sites that you can go visit that look actually quite close to how they looked in the 1860s. But no one ever goes there. Like, whenever I've been there, I've been the only one. I've been like, hello, and the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management people are like, oh, hey, welcome. It's like they haven't seen people for like hours or even days, which is, it's an interesting thing. Like, they've been able to preserve and keep these places, but no one knows about them and no one goes to them because of this kind of emphasis that's solely on the East. I think there was a question in the back. Yeah.
What can you tell us about Juanita's sources? Like, how did you find out about her life and her story? Because I know
Sure.
Those kind of sources are sometimes a little sketchy. So what can you tell us about Juanita's?
Sure. Well, I was really lucky that a Native American historian, Jennifer Nez Dennett-Dale, who teaches at University of New Mexico, is one of Juanita's descendants. And she wrote a book about Juanita and Manuelito. And so what I know about her biography, I know from her work. But also what's interesting, and the reason there are two women in the book, Juanita and Louisa Canby, they're both, I think we can consider them Army wives. And the reason that I can track them through this entire time period is because of their husbands, right? So they enter the record in interesting sorts of ways at different moments, but it's their husbands who get all the attention from the Union Army. But that's super helpful to me, right? Because I know exactly where they are at certain moments. Also, Navajo historians and sociologists have done a great deal to collect oral histories of the Long Walk and the time at Bosque Redondo. And they have collected textiles. And Juanita's Navajo name is translated into Lady Weaver. And she was a very talented weaver. And this was one of her roles. And actually, the photograph that I showed you of her is from 1874, where she was the only woman in the Navajo delegation to go to DC to meet with Ulysses S. Grant. And so, interestingly, she and Kit Carson are the two most photographed people in the book. Because she was this subject, and her weaving was the subject of all of these things. And so we have, I haven't actually seen the textile that she created. It's at the Smithsonian, but there are, the Navajo Museum in Window Rock has textile examples from that period. And then also we have a lot of Navajo sources about textile production and about the important role of women in sheep raising and then also in wool spinning and weaving, and that they created these blankets which were actually really highly valued in the Southwest and traded for a lot of goods. So women were very powerful economic movers in Navajo culture. So, and there have been a lot of studies of Navajo women, and I knew that she, lived traditionally. So there's extrapolation that needs to be done, but we always do that with our sources as historians, right? You sort of take the sources that you have, and if you decide if this person was a typical person or atypical. But the same for Louisa Canby. I only had one letter written in Louisa Canby's voice, and it was from later in the war. It was from 1864, after she had left New Mexico. So I tracked her through her husband. Also, people talked about her because she was the colonel's wife. So she was a prominent woman in Santa Fe, and because after the Battle of Glorieta, she nursed Confederate soldiers who retreated to the city. And they loved her so much for that they called her the Angel of Santa Fe. And they talked about her in their reminiscences. So I actually have kind of proof from two different sources that Bill Davidson, who's a Texas soldier, who's a protagonist in the book, was actually nursed by Louisa Canby, who's another protagonist. So I can put them in the same place at the same time. But that's a really interesting question, because this is, whenever you do any of this kind of work, I mean, Civil War historians are sort of uniquely blessed, I think, because we have so many documents. The reason I know how much Carlton wrote is that all of his correspondence, all of his military correspondence has been collected in multiple kinds of ways, and all, thank goodness, digitized, right? And word searchable, which is just has changed the sort of whole deal for historians now, right? But there are people who don't enter the record, and they tend to be marginalized people, so they tend to be women and people of color. And so in order to recreate their stories, we use whatever we have available to us. Yes, sir?
So, I don't know very much about the Comanches,
Mm-hmm.
the Apache, but I think I've come to believe that people in those days didn't consider the Comanches and the Apaches victims. They felt, or sometimes they felt victimized, and the Comanches ruled there at one point.
Absolutely.
I got the impression that they were just innocent victims of these invading armies. Is it going both ways?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And you'll see in the book that whenever I'm talking about sort of backstories or the history of these communities, it's always a give and take. I mean, Mangus Coloradus was one of the most feared people in northern Mexico because his attacks on Mexican towns were so vicious, right? So it's not like he didn't have, any role to play in all of this. Like, he was a war leader, yeah. And Apaches and Comanches in particular were extremely fierce and were considered by the U.S. Army to be real enemies.
And their neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The other Indian tribes that
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
Apaches.
Yeah, and in fact, Carlton always referred to the Navajos at Bosque Redondo as captives and prisoners. So he was considering them part of the war and enemy combatants, which is, if you want to think about it, a kind of level of respect for their fighting power and their resistance. But yeah, I mean, this is also part of the thing. One of the challenges of writing about Louisa Canby was that no one had a bad thing to say about her. Like, she just seemed too nice, right? I was like, something must be, what's going on with her? Like, where can I find something? Because we like to write, because all people are complicated, right? We all have our good sides and our bad sides. So every single one of the 9 people in this book is a complicated person, Even John Baylor, who looks like the worst person in the world, and he will do, as you will read, terrible things. But he also wrote love poetry to his wife, and dreamed of like moving back with her to Arizona and building a garden. I mean, these were real people who lived in the past, and their personalities were really complex. And what I hope in the book is that I've given you a full sense of them. Yes, ma'am.
This is one of those annoying, why didn't you?
Oh, I love those. I don't find those annoying at all. Why didn't you talk about?
I was wondering about the Bear River Massacre. Since that's the biggest massacre in this time period, it does take place during the
Yes. Yeah. So the reason I did not talk about that particular massacre is that those groups of California soldiers were a different group. They came over in a different migration from California, were sent, and sent specifically first to sort of monitor Brigham Young, right? But then to go after the Shoshones. So I referenced that and Sand Creek and the Minnesota War, the Dakota War in 1862, as all had, like, the 62-63 moment is a sort of moment where the Union Army starts flexing. But it's not a central component of it here, mostly because I was focusing on James Carlton and his Navajo campaigns, which were taking place a little bit further south and were a separate but related war action. So that is why. But I will say, in my next book, which I am currently writing, which is about the 1871 scientific survey to Yellowstone, that survey team goes by the Bear River site, and they mention it. So that will become part of that chapter where I'm talking about them moving through the sort of, the chapter is called A Wilderness of People. So as they're kind of moving north from Ogden, they're passing Mormontown after Shoshone Village, and and they're encountering all of these people who actually live in what many Easterners think is just a wilderness devoid of people. So yeah, so it will have more of a kind of more attention, I guess I would say, in that next book. Yes, Dr. Diaz.
Great talk. So thinking about 1871, so I'm going to ask you maybe the other thing that's annoying,
Uh-huh.
is pushing forward
Yeah.
to Reconstruction.
Yep.
How do we think about Reconstruction as tri-cornered or
Mhm.
continental process?
Right.
And what your take is on that?
No, that's a great question. So the question is about how do we think about Reconstruction as three-cornered, as taking in all the regions. Yeah, because again, in Reconstruction history, if you're just focused on politics and the Reconstruction of the South, that's where all your attention is. But there are larger parts to that story. There's a story of Buffalo soldiers moving west. There's a story of U.S. Army veterans moving west. There's the story that I'm telling in this new book, which is about kind of nationalist projects like the Yellowstone Survey that are meant to unify the nation and sort of bring the nation back together in this sort of like healing process. And that's a more kind of, those are cultural and kind of military aspects that we don't often think about when we think about Reconstruction. And Elliott West was the first historian to really talk about this as a greater Reconstruction, like that we need to think about Reconstruction more fully and sort of expand its time frame a little bit, and then also expand its geography a little bit. And in fact, the Three-Cornered War doesn't end until the summer of 1868. So it's sort of expanding the chronology of the Civil War and saying that it expands. But kind of moving into this Reconstruction period where there's the Peace Commission goes out to try and figure out what to do with all of these indigenous groups in the West to try and make treaties. So this is a different version. They sort of move away from the Carlton mode in some ways, but then they launch all the Indian Wars of the 1870s. And I think part of what I'm trying to argue here, and Ari Kelman, I think, first made this argument too, that we need to think, we shouldn't be just thinking arguments about westward expansion, Civil War, Indian Wars. They were all part of the same process. And so then Reconstruction not only is its own kind of process where we can see the nation kind of trying to knit itself, its broken bones, sort of back together, but it's also part of a longer story. It's not just this moment where we're like, okay, here's the week we're going to do on Reconstruction in the history class, but that we could see its roots in a much longer process, and then we see it also going forward into the future. Do we have one more question? Who gets the last question? Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned the term hard war, which is, of course, historiographically laid in the debate about how unrestrained this war really was. I'm personally convinced by the idea that when you're looking at war between white people in American history, it's remarkably restrained. Then it becomes unrestrained, much harder war when people of color become target.
So the Neely argument.
So I'm persuaded by that, and that's the context in which you introduced hard war in this talk. I just is the Native American aspect part of it, of this far western war, illuminate that, or does the whole far western theater strike you as hard war? And then I guess a second question to that, it relates to destruction. I'm going to ask you to make a moral judgment here. Which is worse, the burning of those documents or the burning of that bacon? I'm on the fence.
Right, yes. I mean, so I'll take the first question first, which is about hard war. I think Neely's arguments are persuasive. So this is the argument that that during the Civil War, when white soldiers were fighting white soldiers and they engaged in destruction of houses and people's belongings, that those kinds of hard war activities were not as destructive as the hard war that they implemented against people of color, notably Native Americans or Mexicans in the Mexican-American War. I think that's persuasive to some extent, although white soldiers did do a lot of destroying of other white people's stuff during the war. And that kind of counts as hard war, or what they called also vigorous war, which is taking the battle to civilians and to civilian property and kind of expanding the battlefield in this way. Now, what's interesting about vigorous war and also guerrilla warfare is that those strategies have origins in the earliest of colonist wars with indigenous people. And this is actually, in some ways, an indigenous way of fighting, which is to take the battle to the community and to take what you can and wreak havoc and then withdraw. And this was certainly Kit Carson's strategy against Navajos. I mean, they very deliberately went in the fall and destroyed everything so that Navajos could not subsist in the winter, and it would force them to surrender. So they were not, I mean, I think there are limits to it, though. I mean, even Carlton, who I mean, he was threatening a war of extermination, but what he was hoping would happen is that that war would force them to surrender. And that is, in fact, what did happen. He said he was willing to go the whole way, but killing women and children was not actually in the orders. The orders were kill the men and take the women and children captive. You know, it's not great, obviously, but it is not full, like, hard war in that sense. Although on the Confederate side, and I should note, this is not just a Union policy. On the Confederate side, John Baylor actually issued an Apache extermination order that said, kill all of the men and enslave the women and the children. So this is part of a policy that I think is entering a lot of the conversations about what civilized warfare actually is. Like, how does a soldier sort of act in a civilized way in this context, right? It seems impossible. But there are limits. And they did, you know, they forced them onto a reservation, and Carlton made all kinds of mistakes. But he writes over and over again, as many kind of, you know, white military officers and politicians did, that these actions were for their benefit, right? To help them survive. So that was part of the rhetoric. To what extent they believed it, I don't really know. So bacon versus documents. I mean, for the Confederates, that bacon, they wanted that bacon. They mourned the loss of a lot of their records and a lot of their, because all of their personal belongings were in those wagons. And they also mourned the loss of their clothes and their animals, I think even more. But yeah, I mean, for them, destruction of the bacon, hands down. For me, I mean, I never want to see bacon go to waste. But yeah, I wish we had those documents. I wish we had those records of the first part of the march, because that would have been invaluable. Well, thanks, you guys. Thanks for coming.